Welcome everybody to week 3. As you know, I'm a little bit behind, but don't worry. I still put up the lectures in the PowerPoints in order of the course guide, but the recorded lectures are somewhat staggered. Now, last week I commenced speaking about Aristotle. I finished speaking about Plato, or the essential features of Plato I wanted you to get. We were talking about the importance of harmony, hierarchy, and balance. And as you can see in the PowerPoint here, there's a whole set of virtues and vices, and they both gravitate around what Aristotle calls the mean, and that's a position of balance, that's a position of harmony. And this is, as we mentioned last week, ultimately what Aristotle is looking for, because he wants to balance the various forces at work within a political community, and indeed you could say in somewhat Platonic terms, within the soul itself. And if you look at this slide there on the right, the principal virtues and vices, you will see that there's a list on the left. I'll just read a few of them: fear and confidence, pleasure and pain, getting and spending, honor and dishonor, anger, and we see some variations of that, and then we see what the excess is. So it's one thing to be courageous, that's a virtue, courage is a virtue, but if you're rash, Aristotle says, well, that's not something that's really cultivated and developed in the soul. That's a spontaneous action that may be lacking in the wisdom and foresight that a more courageous person would have. That is a persistently courageous person. So remember me saying that the ethics was the work that preceded the politics for Aristotle, because he was basically laying down the virtues of what would constitute a good political participant. Hello, come on in. I have a couple online and you, so we're just talking about Aristotle, and we're going through the role of harmony and how central it is to the virtues, and how it is the virtues of a particular kind of person, which we'll see in the next slide, which he calls a great-souled, magnanimous or magnificent man. And that's really the centerpiece of Aristotle. And you will note about that person that this is the kind of person who Aristotle thinks is of real value in helping the polity set its agenda and make judicial and wise decisions. Whereas if we're deficient in the mean, if we deviate from the mean, as I said, the excess was rashness. When we come to courage, cowardice would be the opposite. And as I said, as we go down, we can talk about tense, and we see it: self-indulgence or insensibility. Liberality is the virtue, and prodigality or meanness. Magnificence, tastelessness, niggardliness, vanity, proper pride, pusillanimity, and so on. So you can acquaint yourself with that. I don't really need to go through that in detail, but what it gives you, as I said, is a sense of what a person needs to be like if they're to be of real value to the community in terms of their political endeavor. Now, the great soul man, there's a whole other set of qualities. First of all, the ideas of greatness. They must be worthy of great things. So the way that Aristotle conceives of political action is it someone who is daring but not reckless, who's daring, who has foresight, who's got in a sense a bigger picture, but they have to be worthy of seeing that. So there's something intrinsically of value in them as a person, and that again is exactly what the virtues are, and what ethics is. It's the cultivation of the characteristics that are needed to make one a more judicious, better, more observant kind of person. Note too, it's not exactly identical with the philosopher in the Platonic sense. He's not suggesting, for example, that it's philosophers that will be king. In fact, Aristotle sees that there are serious problems with that. But on the other hand, as we can see, the fact that a philosopher, mainly Aristotle, writes a book called The Ethics and then a book called The Politics, is in a way a means to still make the philosopher really important. So one of the things that's happened, just to repeat the line of continuity between Aristotle and Plato, is that the philosophers have made the argument that they're actually of central importance for good governance. And though, as I mentioned last week, unlike Plato, Aristotle is much more conciliatory towards the poets, because he does think that the poets get a lot right, and he doesn't think that Plato has been really fair to them. Now, when he's talking about the great soul man, he's aware that their position, their power, and their capacity all make them well-observed, important people, in the sense, within the community. So honours is going to be a part of that. They will have honours bestowed upon them. So Aristotle says, well, let's be clear here. Honour is something that's bestowed on you. You may be deserving and not receive an honour, and you may be undeserving and receive an honour. But it's important that you are deserving, and that you can therefore see the relative value of honour. Because if you can't, you will be rancorous when you are not honourably treated. That is, you will move towards one of those vices, and you will lose your sense of balance. So everything here is about this balance. There must be good and greatness in every virtue, he says. And the great soul man, in many ways, an embodiment, and the goodness and greatness are really crowns of the virtue. This also means that with respect, just as with honours, things like wealth and even power, the holding of a specific office, you must realise that fortune also plays a part in this. Again, it's not everything is in your control. So you need to be moderately disposed to that. You don't want to pursue it too much. If you sacrifice who you are, what you are, just in order to receive, to get, to acquire, if you become an acquisitive person, this is really a lack and a deficiency. Now, I'll just raise this here. When we get to the liberal view of social life and political life, as, for example, espoused by John Locke, we'll see the importance, the central importance of the acquisition of wealth and the importance of private property. Now, Aristotle does believe that property is important. He believes sufficient wealth is important. But if he were to read Locke, he would say, look, the real problem with Locke is it's just acquiring for the sake of acquiring. And this is called liberty. As I said, when we get to John Locke, writing in the 17th century, we will treat of that more closely. But what we can see, and what I wish to highlight here, is there's something about the classical view of politics, insofar as it appears, at least in Aristotle, and there's a lot of overlap between Aristotle and Plato in this respect, I think. There is a sense of virtue and the self, and the cultivation of the virtues within the self, being far more important than the external things of the world. Now, some other qualities that he goes through with the great soul man is he repays service with interest. So there's this suggests magnanimity, magnificence. You're giving, you're not just receiving, but you have to have the power within yourself to be able to do that. So that's why the virtues, again, need to be cultivated. They might choose few tasks. Now, Aristotle will criticize Plato for one man, one job. But he does realize there's a danger in just becoming too diffuse, just becoming, your actions becoming thinner by undertaking too much. So he's emphasizing the importance of concentration and focus. That too is part of the balance. They also need to be independent and liberal. And that is also that to be in a possession of one's own virtue, to be a self in this fulfilled way, as Aristotle is conceiving it, means that there is both generosity and liberality, but a certain degree of independence. Because if you lose that independence, then you will be beholden and in being beholden, you won't be able to fulfill your capabilities. Now, also note this. Remember, Aristotle is living in a slave society, and I will talk about his views on slavery soon. And Aristotle's had a somewhat unfortunate legacy with respect to slavery, and his works were used, for example, by white slavers in the 19th century to justify their position. This, though, is a real bowdlerization and distortion of Aristotle. But the point I want to mention by contrasting the free person with slavery is, again, I'll contrast it with the liberal position. The free person in Aristotle is free in terms of being relatively independent. They're not beholden. That is, they're not a slave. But he is not seeking liberty for the sake of liberty. And the whole idea of the acquisitive individual and everyone striving to have much. And some of the spin-offs from that, for example, are the claims that certain groups don't have enough, therefore they should have more. So everything becomes a focus around how much one gets. And then a group of people are trying to gauge exactly what is equal and how is it equal. That's really not what Aristotle is talking about at all. A certain balance, a certain degree, if you like, of equality, that's fine, but there has to be a certain equality of character, of status. So there's all these other preconditions to this, and this again, it's very classical. It's not modern, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's possible to simply superimpose the Aristotelian classical view of life upon the modern. On the other hand, I think there are aspects of this that are well worth considering, because they do get us to focus upon a quality of character which can be easily overlooked. And I'll give you a very good example of the easy overlooking of character. And first of all, I'll talk about Aristotle's Poetics again, and then I'll contrast it to modern literary theory. I've written a few books on literature, and I'm very aware of what is happening generally in literary theory, and I find it somewhat troubling. First of all, let me go back to Aristotle's Poetics. In the Poetics, when Aristotle is looking at tragedy, he makes the argument that really what is central to what we learn about tragedy is the nature of character. And the importance of character is, or studying character, observing character as in a drama, the importance of this is that we can see qualities that we wish that we could emulate. And we also see tragic actions that are undertaken, which we see ultimately do damage, even though the actor has no idea at the moment of the act that the consequences will be very dire. Now, one of the things, now I'll move that, so that's Aristotle's view of poetics, and along with Plato, and much more so even than Plato, because as we said, Plato's view of poetry is really just driven by one major factor, that is the death of Socrates and the complicity that Plato sees the poets of having in that death. The unintended complicity, but nevertheless complicity. Aristotle is really the founder of literary criticism. He lays down what it is about any kind of literature. He does focus on tragic drama, but poetry is also in the mix here. And of course, remember that drama was a form of poetry for the ancient Greeks. That in focusing upon character, our criticism should be directed to the question of what does this work offer us as a community? So in this respect, it does have a certain link with modern literary criticism. And indeed, you will also remember me saying that Aristotle's influence in the Middle Ages was very strong, but ultimately there was a lot of reaction to that, especially because his writings on physics. And I'll raise that again much later in the semester when I talk about the modern natural sciences and how Aristotle was perceived as an obstacle. However, in literary criticism, well into the 20th century, Aristotle's Poetics was still considered a masterpiece. So if you were studying English in the 1950s or 1960s, you would have to read Aristotle. And most literary critics, I know that seems a long way back, but you would still have to study Aristotle. So that was one area, and possibly the other area where Aristotle still had a wide degree amongst the educated of support and recognition as a master was in the area of political science. What happened though in literary theory, and this actually touches something I will be mentioning in the final week. What happens in political theory, literary theory, is that literature comes to be viewed in terms of sociological and political terms, and ethnic terms, and gender terms, and all these other ways of breaking up people into groups. But what disappears in literary theory is the primacy of character. And in fact, for someone who's studying literature today at in a PhD program, for example, in the United States or in the United Kingdom, where they actually have programs, especially in the United States, where they all have to do these programs as well as write their thesis, it's highly unlikely that they would ever be assigned works on character. And Aristotle himself contributed to the study of character, not just in the Poetics, but there were someone like La Bruyere, writing in the 17th or 18th century, wrote a book on character, and that had a very long pedigree, and it was seen as important in literature. But with the displacement, that is, there's simply no interest in character, because ultimately you're a representative of a type, a representative of your race or your ethnicity or your gender, and the text then is broken down into what this is doing socially and politically in terms of domination and non-domination, you can, or emancipation. You can see this is a complete break, and one of the factors behind that break is the primacy of principle, that you start using principles, you start using social principles. Or another way of saying this, you've become more abstract than what Aristotle was. So Aristotle is looking at the fine grain of detail, whether he's studying constitutions or whether he's studying literature. And in this case, in political science more generally, and in this case also the ethics. Okay. Another thing about the great souled person is they're not resentful. They're not prone to admire others. You know, in one sense you could say they're full of themselves. But when often we say someone is full of themselves, we mean this in a very negative term. But the way Aristotle means it is they're full of themselves because they know who they are, and what they're doing. They have a good self-appreciation, so they don't value themselves too much. In this, it reminds me of, again, I think something that's almost subconsciously taken over from Plato with the emphasis upon the skills. Because of my love of music and my love of guitars and guitar playing, etc., I really notice how really good musicians, they are very much like this. They're full of themselves, but at the same time, they're not boastful, and they also know who does better than them. Maybe they admire more in a way that Aristotle is talking about, but there's something similar, and that is, they have a good sense of where they are in the order of things. So there's a kind of, you could say there's a kind of transcendence, a kind of giving oneself over to something higher, and that's really what a virtue is. It's that higher thing to which you've given yourself over. Coming back to some of the grain of this, they do not gossip, they do not complain. And he actually goes so far as to say his gait is measured, his voice is deep, and speech unhurried. So he really wants to tie this to the minutiae of communication, even the kind of voice you have. They're not highly strung. They take few things seriously. In a time of panic, for example, they know what is really serious and where people are simply panicking and out of control. You know, Aristotle wouldn't see his great soul man as squabbling over toilet paper in Woolworths over the coronavirus, for example. He would see them as leading by example. Now, so that's actually the kind of character that Aristotle seeks to cultivate for those interested in political life, and that's character is central, as I said, to the politics and the ethics. But Aristotle is also very aware, and in this, again, very much a student of Plato, and we recall he was actually a student of Plato. He attended Plato's lectures. That political life is ultimately, in its search for harmony and its search for balance, it is seeking the ultimate political good is justice. So it's about justice. So justice is going to be a central thematic, just as it was in the Republic. We recall that the subtitle of the Republic was On the Just, that on the Aristotle's Politics is really also a study of justice. And he defines it as being law-abiding and fair, and it produces and conserves the happiness of a political association. I'll get back to that concept of happiness. It's very important. The Greek word that he uses is eudaimonia, E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N-I-A. So eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is not just a kind of frivolous happiness. Again, if I go back to Plato, Plato spent a lot of his time attacking people who simply pursued pleasure. And pleasure is likened by Plato to an itch that you scratch. You know, you get pleasure when you scratch an itch. And he sees that the things that make it pleasurable are often things like an itch which we scratch. Again, Aristotle, though there are elements in Plato that lead in this direction, but Aristotle sees pleasure in conjunction with happiness and in conjunction ultimately with justice and goodness. Now, justice is a complete virtue in relation to someone else as well. So justice is about our dealings with others as well as how we are in ourselves. So again, if we go back to the great soul person or the great soul man, and it is men, we recall saying how lacking in political rights women in Athens were, and social rights. And we'll see how he deals with women too in a short while. But it's also in our dealings with others. That is, we should be dealing justly with others. And if we're not, he says, this is where problems begin. Now, he makes a division within justice, which has had a huge consequence. And the division actually comes not simply from his head. It's a real distinction that had already been occurring in the Greek city-states, and it depended upon two things. One is a distribution of resources, and that were due to certain problems within the state that may not necessarily have been due to specific acts of injustice, but have become part of the problem of the social complex, where these behaviors are set in train and you end up with a great number of poor people. And how do the poor people then participate in the assembly? Well, one way of doing this is that you pay them to go and leave their farm, because they usually have come from the farm surrounding Athens. You pay them to come in. And this is an example of the kind of thing that Aristotle is calling distributive justice. But he's not just focused between rich and poor. The other is rectificatory justice. I'll just come back to distributive justice just for a moment. In part as a response to and an intensification of the development of the welfare state, which is really a 20th century phenomenon. The roots of the ideas and the importance of the labour movement, that go back to the 19th century. But within the middle of the 20th century, the welfare state was a common phenomenon in industrial democracies. And indeed, the consensus was that the state had to provide welfare. So it had to redistribute resources. So in the but this idea became a major thinking point for a lot of political philosophers from about the 1960s and 1970s. And there was a book which I'll mention called by John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, called A Theory of Justice. And the whole thing was about distributive justice. And this set off a huge number of books and articles about the distributive function of the state. Often, interestingly, far less commonplace, though there were works written on rectificatory justice. And rectificatory justice is about restoring the inequities. So if someone does wrong, how do you go about restoring them? And punishment is something that figures under rectificatory justice. Okay, whereas resource transference is distributive. Punishment might also mean a fine, and it did not only in classical Greece, but it did in many tribal societies and tribes throughout Europe. And some European tribes, for example, if someone cut off your finger or gouged out your eye, there would actually be a price that you had to pay for that part of the body. So the different parts of the body were itemized. And that was part of a great big rectificatory system of justice that was operative in the group. So how then do we get this balance? And this too requires kind of wisdom. Ultimately, we'll see this is what he calls, well, I'll just go to the last point. This is prudence or practical wisdom. It's a virtue. It's a virtue. It's not. It combines bits of art and science. It's not just one thing or another. But you have to have a certain psychological acumen, but you have to have knowledge. And by science here, he just means knowledge. That word has been used in translation, but it doesn't mean what we mean by modern science. A judge is someone that is required. And remember, it's a very different kind of legal system involving the assembly. It's not what when he's speaking about a judge, he's speaking about a magistrate within a larger political context, which is not completely akin to, in many ways, nothing like what we have in a courtroom. So it's quite a public forum. But the judge has to be personified justice. And you can see that's exactly those characteristics that we looked at in the first slide and then with the great old man. He also argues that there's political justice involves a combination of what he calls natural justice and civil law. This idea will have a very, very long pedigree, and we will come up against it in the course. And the idea of natural justice had been played out in a great drama called the Antigone by Sophocles. And the point at issue was that two brothers had found themselves in a political conflict. And one of them had been killed by the one that had gained the throne, so to speak. And his sister, Antigone, I'm pretty sure they were brothers, I'm a bit murky on that, but the sister, anyway, of Polynices, that was leading the rebellion, is killed. And the other one, I think it's Creon, I think is the name, but it's quite a while since I've read it, prohibits his burial. But Antigone is determined to bury her brother because burial is seen as a natural law, that you must bury your dead. And as a member of the family, that is a sacred obligation. So the sacred obligations must take priority over what is essentially a human legislator decreeing something. So and Aristotle is saying there should be this kind of attempt to match these up. You shouldn't deviate from that natural law. This, in the Middle Ages, there would be, and also within Roman law, especially with a guy called Cicero, we might come up against him later in the course. I go into him in some detail in the other course on Foundations of Western Civilization. But Cicero argues that natural law is a universal law. It's the same whether it's in Athens or Jerusalem or some other part of the world. how much they actually knew about tribal societies is, not that much. So Aristotle had the benefit of having read Herodotus, at least, who had travelled widely and met all these different groups and was astonished by them. Herodotus is fantastic. If you haven't read his histories, you should read it. Anyway, this idea, one way it's kept alive in Aristotle, he says, well, this is the idea of equity, and we still have what's called equity law. It's a branch of law. And for Aristotle, equity is the recreation of law insofar as law is defective. So we may not have a specific law dealing with a problem. We recognize that something is inequitable. And for this, we need a sense of natural justice, and this is also why we need a judge to be personified justice. Now, here he spelled out what justice is, and then Aristotle goes into what he is doing, what political science is. And he says politics, the study of politics, it's the master science. It's the fullest realization of prudence. And this is, I'm going to quote two bits from the Ethics. They're both centerpieces in many ways of the Ethics. The study of pleasure and pain belongs to the province of the political philosopher, for he is the architect of the end, with a view to which we call one thing bad and another good without qualification. Further, it is one of our necessary tasks to consider them, for not only did we lay it down that moral virtue and vice are concerned with pains and pleasures, but most people say that happiness involves pleasure. That is why the blessed man is called by a name derived from a word meaning enjoyment. So here we touch on what he means by pleasure, that there are pleasures of the body and there are pleasures of the soul. And you will recall me talking about Aristotle's metaphysics, where he talks about the mind contemplating itself and the contemplative life being the highest. And so to be engaged in contemplation of the cosmos, which is the larger totality, and then the smaller totality, the polis, that for him is immensely pleasurable. It helps you understand the processes at work in your living environment and in your own soul. So to study that is the most, for Aristotle, it's the most pleasurable of all things. Again, we can see that it's kind of taking over from Plato. Remember Plato, or Plato's Socrates in the Republic, had been arguing with Glaucon, with everybody there, or talking to everybody there, and then they all fell asleep and Glaucon's left standing. And he's really trying to draw in, and seems he successfully does so, Glaucon into the path of philosophy as showing that it is the best, and ultimately, in its way, it's the most pleasurable. That is, it's the most pleasurable for intelligence. Okay, this is also about political science. Now, all forms of community are like parts of the political community, and we'll come back to that, and I'll just signal it here. It's all about parts and wholes. Remember talking about me saying that Aristotle saw things in terms of structure, in terms of the study of form, so the morphology of things, and that's how he goes and looks at. So you're looking at how parts relate to the whole. And the part is really nothing without the whole, even though the whole is also, there's a mutual symbiosis or symbiosis going on, a mutual dependency. Each is forming the other. So they're not operating independently. So you're not building up the world, and I'll signal how the moderns break with him. When, for example, you get to modern physics and Descartes lays down a new kind of metaphysics, he wants to rebuild the world on the basis of going down to the simplest elements. So the whole is a product of those simples put together. That's very anti-Aristotle. And again, when we look at why Descartes objects so much to Aristotle, we will see why he takes this move. But I think we could see that for political life, that Aristotle is actually onto something, that you can't just break down the parts into the whole, that you put the parts together, but unless there's some glue or binding, overarching set of commitments and appeals of the whole, those parts won't link up the way they would if they're lacking, as opposed to if they're there. Oh, it should be. That's not a virus. That's a smoker's cough. So for men journey together with a view to some particular advantage and to provide something that they need for the purposes of life. And it is for the sake of the advantage that the political community too seems both to have come together originally and to endure, that this is what legislators aim at, and they call just that which is the common advantage. So what a political scientist is doing and what the study of political science is, it's about identifying what is the good of a community. So what is the good and what are the goods? And he will then identify the fact that it is going to deviate between communities. And although it's possible, and he will follow Plato in doing this, and coming up with some ideal, some ultimately best system if everything was good, and in fact, the deficiencies of the community are ultimately going to be factored into what type of goods there are. And I'll come back also. You recall me when I was speaking about Aristotle's theory of causation and of causes. I mentioned that everything has a purpose. So when we broke down the four causes, and we could see that, the end of if you've got a cup, it is to drink. But ultimately, of course, drinking is to sustain life. So we see that these purposes go right back to the nature of what it is to be alive and what it is, the purposeful nature of not only human being, but of the cosmos as a whole. So Aristotle, in another place, again, that's in the Metaphysics, he says, I will just say this, by the way, now it's come into my mind. The Metaphysics was called the first philosophy, and the word metaphysics has now become a commonplace within philosophical language. That is the study of first principles, the highest principles of thought, of classification, but also the highest principles of what is real, what is truth. Now, that name, metaphysics, simply came through someone cataloguing that set of lectures that Aristotle gave. And it was classified after physics, and that's what metaphysics means, after the physics, strictly speaking, or beyond the physics. And it's the next book beyond the physics. So but when he does talk about metaphysics, just generally, he's making a claim about everything in all life, the universe as a whole, it is a teleological view of life. It is one in which everything has a purpose, and to understand that purpose is central for human life, and it's central for political science. So you have to understand the nature of what it is to be human, what's the purpose of being human, and what is the purpose of community. And that is the common advantage which helps all ultimately become more virtuous. Now, what Aristotle has said there is that, and he recognizes, he has enough historical knowledge to know that the polis, the city-state, which by the way was dying in his time, because Alexander, who you recall me saying, who he taught, who he was the tutor of, was now on this imperial mission, and the city-states were under dire threats. They still existed, but now they were under an imperial order, and eventually the city-state would become defunct. So, like Plato, Aristotle does believe that the city-state is the best unit of political organization. One of the reasons they believe that is because of its scale, because it offers the benefits of larger scale in terms of industrial, division of labor, and the different classes and pursuits that can be undertaken where there is a large scale division of labor and different classes of people doing different things. So that happens, but it's also sufficiently small that ultimately you will know someone who knows someone who knows someone. So there is a kind of community. So both Aristotle and Plato, if they had seen the scale of modern cities, would have said this is really bad for political life. It's really bad because other people just disappear in terms of abstraction. And I think there's really a point in this. I think a lot of people who are members of the same class simply do not see members of another class other than through their own filters. And that's why they often make pronouncements about them, about very large groups of people, but they never have any contact with them unless they might go into a shop or something, but no real personal contact. So for Aristotle, this connectedness, the social bonds, is an intrinsic part of a good political community. Now, I said that Aristotle realized that the city-state is a rather late development historically. We know historically that first humans basically live in small groups or bands. Aristotle calls them families, but they're much smaller groups. Then when there's more of them and they group together, usually for protection, common pursuits, but it's for some kind of mutual advantage, which is very much along the lines of what Aristotle is saying. And this mutual advantage leads to what's called a tribe. And then he sees their villages being set up. And this is the beginning of a kind of division of labor and creates an opportunity. And then when he's saying, what's being translated as the state here is really the city-state. Now, note this, he says the state is natural. And this is, again, it comes out of this teleological way of seeing things, which is very different to the modern. When we get to Thomas Hobbes, who tries to create another science of politics on the basis of modern scientific ideas, it's very anti-Aristotelian, consciously so. And Hobbes was interested in the natural sciences, and Hobbes used the stuff from the natural sciences to try and understand political community. When we get there, Hobbes will say, the state is not natural, it's an artifice. It's an artifice. It's something, and you might have heard the term, became very popularized through the 1970s and 1980s. It's a social construction. Now, I will talk about that in much more detail later. I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that Aristotle is not saying this is something that was socially constructed in the sense that it could have come up with something completely different. There's no arbitrariness in this. There's something about the development of the human species in its collective formation, which he believes invariably requires that the state comes into being. So you can see one problem from the more natural science point of view is that suggesting that there's something that's in existence even prior to what you can see, or what you might even know. There's something prior to that. And Aristotle says, well, of course there is, and there's a reason that shows that. But they will say, they will beg to differ. So the state is natural. It's because of the kind of creature we are, the kind of bonds that we form, and ultimately the kind of capacities that we develop once we have a certain division of labor and once the scale of our activities is transformed. And he sees that whereas in the family, so that's the smallest group, what I call the bands, it's basically survival, material appetites. When you get to village life, I'm sorry, I've lost a word there, reflected in village life, social. So when there's more people grouped together with differences, then they start to become more socialized. And he says, but our moral nature, this only happens once we're in a city-state. And you can see the movement from material appetites to social sentiments to moral nature. That's a triadic movement. It might immediately put in your head the ideas that Plato was having about the soul. But this is cultivated across time, but ultimately it's moving towards a purposefulness. It's good. It's good. Nature makes nothing in vain. That's a very Aristotelian idea. It's making things for good. Now, that also means if, for example, someone is mute or someone is blind or someone is deformed at birth. For Aristotle, this is a kind of defect in nature. This is a mistake. This is something in the material and the form that didn't quite fit. And again, what he's suggesting is, and really bear this in mind, just as I've emphasized the importance of the mean and balance, another word we might use is Aristotle is very much the thinker of the healthily normal, what he perceives as a healthily normal. So, and things should try, or things do aspire to that, and not everything gets that. But as someone interested in political science, as someone who wants to draw up a constitution, as someone who wants to guide the city in how to act better, then they need this sense of the healthy normal, the healthy norm, which is the good. And it's to try and perceive what the telos is, what the purpose is in any configuration that observes in nature. That's why mankind always acts in order to obtain that which they think is good, is what he says. It doesn't mean they always achieve it and they get mistaken and their intelligence is deficient. Again, we can see that the tremendous burden that the philosopher is putting upon the deployment of intelligence. And as much as the moderns have deviated from Aristotle in all sorts of ways, this faith in intelligence, I think, is the essential thing that links the ancients and the moderns in the or the classical and the modern view of the role of the intellectual and their contribution to social life. And I'll say this bluntly, and you'll see why I'm saying this a little later in this lecture. When we get though to the Christian view of social and political life, there's a lot of rethinking around this, because it does start from the idea that our intelligence is so limited. It depends how it's informed. It depends whether there's something divine that's inspiring that intelligence or not. And if it's not, then the view of life will be deficient. Ultimately, and we see this in Dante's great medieval book, The Divine Comedy. I think I mentioned it last week. And I will mention again, it's just one of those books that everybody should read. It's hard work. It's really hard work, but it's great. So written between 1300 and 1307. When he begins, Dante tells the story of first of his descent into hell, and then he goes up through purgatory and then into heaven. Right at the outskirts of hell, so that if you like, the nicest part of hell. And it's not really bad. It's not really a terrible thing. He sees philosophers, and Aristotle is named because for the medievals he had become the philosopher who's considered by far the greatest and the most important. They're walking around in essentially the outer skirts of hell. Why are they in the outer skirts of hell? Because of the limits of what they could know and what they didn't know, and because they didn't have access to the revelation. So that is, I'm just signaling, once you get to the Christian view of life, this view of intelligence, it may be completely mistrusted, as it is by some Christians, or by others. And when I say some Christians, I'm talking about really interesting and very intelligent Christians in themselves, and they give, quite powerful arguments about the deficiencies of the intellect. And then we'll see others, if I'm just jumping to the medieval period again, say St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived before Dante, but who Dante greatly admired, who's one of the greatest minds that ever lived, by the way. So a great intellect who really does see the intellect as really important in life. But nevertheless, that importance cannot be divorced from the revelation. It cannot be divorced from that. So there's just something else that's going on. Okay. So within this too, we see that man is a political animal. Just to sum things up, is a political animal, and that phrase has become a kind of platitude, really. But it's the whole is prior to the part. I mentioned that. The state is prior to the family prior to the individual. No, so what occurs historically does not mean that that is what is should predominate in terms of the hierarchy that you're using to try and fathom how we should act within a state. So that the state must take precedence over a family, and the family must take precedence over the individual. This is often called to the organic theory of the state. It's an organic theory. So it's symbiotic, and it's organized, and it's orderly. In this sense, by the way, it reflects exactly how Aristotle sees the whole universe. The whole universe is predicated upon a divine intelligence. And you remember me saying that the book of Genesis, it's nothing like this idea of design. It's nothing like it. This is really a design theory of intelligence, and ultimately of the highest intelligence, which is God. So authority then is conceived in terms of wholes and parts. And then Aristotle goes through and he discusses the role of slaves and women before he gets to free men. And, you know, the great souled man, the political person, that's really where it's getting at. But he talks about slaves and women. And first of all, they're parts of a household. And the word oikia is a Greek word for household, and it's where we get the word economics from. So it's and the household, remember me saying, the family exists to deal with material appetites and for the goods that are necessary for survival. Aristotle is, in a sense, the first economist, and there's actually a theory of value, of economic value, going on in Aristotle. You know, Aristotle is look. There's no two ways about it. It's genius. There's genius in here, and the genius is the breadth of his vision of social and political and human life and non-human life as well. Even when he makes some really grievous or egregious errors, the fact that he sees the connectedness between things, it's astonishing. And his range and breadth extend far beyond anyone that we know that preceded him, which is why, again, in the Middle Ages, he was called the philosopher. It's just, unfortunately, though, in the Middle Ages, they tended to think if he said it, it was true. And Aristotle himself had used the phrase, which I think I mentioned last week, I love Plato, but I love the truth more than Plato. And that's how one has to be to Aristotle. I love Aristotle, but I love the truth more than Aristotle. So when he comes to talk about the household, the fact was that in ancient Greece, slaves were an important part of the household. Now, in the main, it was considered very bad form for the Greeks to mistreat their slaves. Let's just say that, even though that is their household slave. There were slaves that went off to the silver mines. And that was a pretty horrible and wretched life, and short-lived life. That was horrible. The household slave could very often even become a friend of the family, become a tutor within the family. And we see in the Iliad, where we see Odysseus, sorry, not the Iliad, the Odyssey. We see Odysseus returning to his father's farm, and you can see his father and his slave working in cooperation together. And actually, what Odysseus' father owned was very little. So let's not compare this with the great big farms that were, though some of them were increasing in scale, and there were larger farms and larger scale slaveholders, but they were nothing like what was happening in Rome and the way slavery was occurring in Rome. But even in Rome, sometimes a household slave would become a friend of the family. And Aristotle discusses, and it is an issue in Athenian law, and it will become an issue in Roman law, what's called manumission. That is it possible for the slave to get freedom? And Aristotle argues, look, there's lots of slaves that should be given freedom. They should be given freedom. And then he introduces this distinction. There's a slave by nature and there's a slave by laws. So someone is a slave everywhere and someone is a slave nowhere, even if they are legally a slave. but their character is not slavish. So he binds us up with slavery. So he does not give an argument for the liberation of slaves, which from a modern point of view he will be criticized for, because this idea of slavery. He says actually in one point that if we could make machines like Daedalus, apparently, who made all these little contrivances and machines, if we had the whole world, you know, we were able to live off the machines making everything, and ultimately that's what Descartes wants, is machines making everything, just to jump ahead to the modern. If we could do that, then we wouldn't need slaves, but we can't. So he's dealing with, and I think there's also a bit of a barb here. He's also saying there are some freemen out there, you know, they're real dummies. You know, they're really just slaves by nature. And that again, that kind of narrative is something that we also find in Plato. Who remember, the tyrant is a slave to the appetites. So this word slave is being used both in terms of nomenclature of political and social obligation, but it's also being used in terms of character. So certainly, and to underscore this, certainly Aristotle recognizes that there's an issue. There is an issue here. And he certainly doesn't support any kind of cruelty towards one's slave. In fact, you remember what the great soul man is like. You just transpose that now to the master of a household. And this is also, so in this sense, it's very patriarchal. It's very conservative. Conservative in a good sense, but still conservative. That is, it's one in the sense of, we would in more modern times use the sense of noblesse oblige. You should show your liberality and generosity. But that doesn't change the status of things. The status ultimately is impregnable. And again, one criticism that can fairly be made of Aristotle is that Aristotle, in trying to hold the whole together, ultimately prevents the better. But the kind of explosions you need to get the better may be so dire that it's at least understandable why. Usually, though, and this we will talk about this later in the semester, but usually when there's a social explosion, that social explosion, it's not simply an act of will or consciousness. There's a whole set of causes leading to a social breakdown, which leads to a new kind of order. So Aristotle is emphasizing the limits of order and the limits of nature. And as with Plato, and again I'll contrast with the modern, we tend to think of the lack of limit very often as a good thing. It's limitless. You know, I've got limitless power. I've got limitless this. You know, it should be unending progress, never-ending progress. I'm not saying it's wise or smart, but I'm getting a head nod going, no. And I don't disagree with you, but it's quite a widespread way that modern people talk. Whereas Plato and Aristotle both thought limit was central to anything being good. And if it overreached its limits, just as we saw with the sphere of feeling and actions, this was a bad thing. But what we also notice here, and this again signaling what's coming up later in this lecture and in the next lecture, is there's an absence of the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. They're not really there. There's bits of stuff that Aristotle says about friendship that does capture an aspect of love. But faith, hope, and love introduce a new triad, and for the medievals, we find this in Dante again, for example, the Christian virtues actually supplement and complement, but build on top of and add to the classical virtues. So what this comes back to, as I said, the self is seen in these limited terms, so there's not a sense of a great transformation over time, which will ultimately create a new and ultimately much better world. And there's both advantages and disadvantages in that second way of seeing things. But there are considerable disadvantages and there are considerable advantages. But one of the things that, I think I've said this before, but it's something I say frequently, one of the things about solutions to problems is they always create new problems, and that is the human lot. So, look, I might let you read this at your own leisure. This is a more detailed account of the slave and of the family and of woman, and I'll just mention a couple of things here. I forgot to. I bypass women, and I'll talk about it here. First of all, Aristotle argues that the slave is really lacking the capacity to properly reason. Now, one argument you might make is, well, they rarely have the opportunity to do that because they're simply under instruction all the time. So they're not there to display initiative. They're not there to try and sort out the bigger problems. That is for the master of the household, and that is also for the members of the political community to sort out and engage in. So the level of their narrative formation, so to speak, their capacity and their basic capacity, their rhetorical skills that are needed to speak in the assembly, their philosophical cultivation, are such, because of the task they're doing, that will never happen. On the other hand, I'll say straight away, in ancient Rome, the Greeks now, who were essentially a captive people, they were tutors. They were the wise guys. They were knowledgeable. And there were philosophers that were even slaves. One very famous Stoic philosopher is called Epictetus, who was a slave. So, and you also had an emperor who was a slave. So from that Stoic point of view, there's something much closer to the modern point of view in terms of how we want to understand the soul. And you could say that the deficiency of Aristotle here is he's looking too closely at what actually is going on and not looking at what could go on, not looking sufficiently at the potential. And this also is the case when he discusses women. He does say that women, they can deliberate, you know, so, and obviously he must have had enough experience with women to know, and one thinks of Socrates' wife and the legends that surround her, how she was always haranguing and harassing Socrates, but also, you know, giving advice. So I'm sure lots of Athenians' wives gave their husbands advice about all sorts of things, and I don't think human nature is that different in that respect. But he clearly thinks that the differences between men and women are such, plus the opportunities, but the opportunities are constitutive of the social environment, which Aristotle thinks is a very good social environment. So he sees men and women having very different roles. He sees the state as beholden to, the family is beholden to the state, but ultimately in the family there is a set of different responsibilities. The women must look after the children, the men must go to war when that is necessary, but they almost must participate in preserving the peace, which is, and maintaining justice, which is part and parcel of involvement in political life. So they need to be trained, women need to be trained by education with an eye to the Constitution. But ultimately, the different role becomes, requires different things. And as I said, a woman's role is in obeying. This is very traditional, very conservative. It doesn't fly well in the face of the moderns. And it is a different world that we have. It's a whole set of different opportunities. It's a different world. But you could say against Aristotle that you can only have that different world if you don't believe this. On the other hand, as I said, Aristotle is trying to preserve a well-balanced, a good sense of order. He's not unaware of the dangers of things like jealousy, these kind of issues that become part and parcel of tragic drama, or thematics of tragic drama. But ultimately, each is part of the whole. He makes a criticism of Plato and the critique of, so I've mentioned that there's many things that Aristotle has in common with Plato, primarily the commitment to philosophy, the commitment to intelligence, the way in which he perceives purposefulness, the way he perceives the virtues, etc. But ultimately, when he talks about Plato in the Politics. He says the abolition of the family. He says Plato doesn't actually spell out whether it's just for the guardians or for everybody, but in any case, let's just assume it's for the guardians. That's contrary to nature. And you remember me saying that Plato does get in all sorts of entanglements around this, which is why some Plato scholars say Plato wasn't really serious in the Republic, that his ideal state is a kind of comic thing that could never be realized. He's sort of mocking utopia. Well, Aristotle didn't think that. Let's just, you can read it. If you read Alan Bloom's translation, which is the one I've suggested you read, the translation's fantastic, but you read his introductory essay. He makes a very vigorous and strong case for that. And I was kind of attracted to that. And I was learning ancient Greek, and I remember the sneering look my Greek teacher, who had been reading Plato all his life, gave me when I said, I think, you know, Bloom might be onto something. Forget it. I've come round to his point of view, which is Aristotle's point of view. He also argues, which I've mentioned, Aristotle emphasizes unity too much. The other thing is the abolition of property. Again, it looks like for Plato, the abolition of property is just for the guardians and the philosophers, but ultimately, and this is part, as I also mentioned, seems to be part of the Spartan enchantment hold of enchantment over Plato and Socrates. They looked at the Spartans, well, they're pretty good, but no free man from Athens apart from them, or, you know, small group, not many, really liked Sparta, and Aristotle really didn't like Sparta. By the way, Aristotle was apparently very self-conscious about his appearance. He seemed to be legends, but very well dressed and urbane and sophisticated. You know, nothing like a Spartan, to put it bluntly. Aristotle was not, and you don't get any pro-Spartan sensibility coming through in Aristotle. So, but he does recognize that property is an issue. And there had been good reasons to recognize it. We might recall, I might have mentioned it, that Solon, so going back to the 600s, I think 600s, Solon had to introduce legislation because so many of the free Greeks had enslaved themselves, because when they'd been away fighting everything, their farms had broken down and they needed money, and the only way they could get it was to indenture themselves as slaves. And so Solon had prohibited this, but there was always a danger of things going to rack and ruin. It could be a poor harvest, it could be external forces, whatever. It could just be bad luck. You know, you've had an accident or something you can't farm, whatever. Aristotle recognizes that there seem to be too many farmers buying up other people's farms, and this is dangerous. And in the laws, Plato had actually laid down the number of plots should be I think 5,000, if I recall right. And Aristotle says, well, you can't really control that, because, you know, when the kids are born, and how then do you subdivide that? And this gets really complicated. But as a general principle, and this is a nice thing about Aristotle. Again, I think it's a bit of a difference between him and Plato. He's happy to be a bit, if you like, smudgy. You know, not realize that, look, there's a good idea of a principle, but you can't push it too far. But as a general thing, yeah, you can't completely equalize it, but you need to train nobles not to desire too much, and you don't want to, you know, and spend all the time preventing the lesser from getting more, and you don't want the lesser just being acquisitive. You want people to be pretty happy with what they've got, provided it, which is why you need distributive justice, so that people are happy enough with what they've got. And you certainly don't want, again, as a modern, you certainly don't want just everyone thinking that the pursuit of wealth is the highest thing that can be done. That's going to be a disaster. Aristotle has no candle to hold for the very wealthy. He does not think they're a very good force. His ultimate position is he sides with the middle class. And again, that's not surprising, given balance, the mean, and everything. So when it comes to citizenship, he thinks citizens, they share in the administration of justice and the holding of offices. Each state or each kind of state has its own form of citizenship. He distinguishes between the virtues of the citizen, the virtues of a good man, perfect virtue. And remember, the great soul man is really as much a good citizen as a good man. In fact, more. It's the civic qualities that Aristotle is focused on. He says each state is looking for happiness. He does see education as the key to state happiness, but you need to educate people for the different roles. Again, wholes and part is coming into play. So a constitution is the arrangement of the magistrates' offices in a state. The government is everywhere. The government has to be sovereign, so the state and the government become one. The constitution is essentially the government. The main two that he sees in operation in Greece, and he's quite right about this, they tend to be the rule of the many citizens, like Athens, or they tend to be the rule of the rich. And when I come back to Athens, you can see that this conflict between oligarchy and democracy seems to have been a perennial and persistent one. The aristocracy, which Plato had talked about, and which Aristotle also talks about, that's, that means the best, which, and in Greece, the best also meant pedigree. So your family name, you were from a good family, and somehow you inherited these qualities. You see, this is pretty rare. That it's very often the oligarchs. So it's not just having a good family name's of so much benefit, but ultimately it doesn't amount to a lot when it comes to how constitutions actually come about. The value of democracy is that there's lots of different points of view, and to this day, I would say that's probably the most, or one of the. There's a couple of others, but one of the most important insights about democracy. Even Plato reluctantly admits this with democracy, even though there's all sorts about the democracy. Remember, the Democrats killed Socrates, that drive Plato mad. Aristotle is more conciliatory, but he does, like Plato, accept that democracy has to be governed by law. But this different points of view is something that's an important factor. So he tries to balance. This is really the major achievement of the politics. It's really already, you can see Plato working on this, but Aristotle, does it with greater grain of detail, greater sophistication. So you're trying to balance the power of numbers and the power of wealth. He does concede the best government, if you could get it, would be an all-wise monarch, which would be something like Hesiod's idea of Zeus. If you were all-seeing and all-knowing, well, that of course, but not likely. Not likely, not even really possible for Aristotle. Because also, one ruler, even if they start off good, can easily become a tyrant. They'll just simply through their behavior, they get everything they want, and then they start to lose sight. The temptations are just too great. So it's not really an answer to anything. He also wants to balance liberty and equality. Now, again, when we come to the moderns, the thing that we will notice is that by far the most important drivers of modern political thinking are liberty and equality. For some, they're seen as completely in tandem. For others, they require a sacrifice of one towards the other. You could say that the more liberal political economic view of the world will sacrifice equality for liberty. You could say the more socialistic view of the world will sacrifice economic liberty for political equality and economic equality. That's true. The thing though, I noticed something very different between Aristotle and more modern ways of thinking about politics. Is the modern ways of thinking about politics is the drivers of liberty and equality are so strong that these other characteristics, these other virtues tend to diminish altogether. They tend only to be seen in terms of one of these two. And I'll come back to, I was mentioning literary studies before, because literary studies is so now politically driven. And in many ways, the study of English literature has become a kind of hegemonic leading discipline within the humanities. Not here in Darwin, and to some degree Australia, but much more definitely so in the United States, I would say. That doesn't mean that everybody in the other faculties goes along with them, but in the main, they have tended to convince their students and many other teachers in the humanities that the most important principle in investigating any social or political issue is whether it is one of domination or emancipation. Domination or emancipation. Now, this you can see is exactly what I'm talking about with the modern, and it does come out which I will talk about later when we trace its pedigree. We can see that it very much comes out of liberty and equality, but of course, as you look at that narrative, which is emancipation means liberty, but when you look closely at it, oppression, domination also means inequality. So you've got this dialectic happening, but there's the kinds of variables that both Plato and Aristotle thought were really, really important, as indeed the kind of variables or appeals, the ideas that the Christians thought were really important. They tend to dissipate. They tend to not play a big role. Which is why, as a political theorist, very often political theorists who are conversant in the tradition, they're not on board with that program. And they're not on board with it because they've got a whole range of references which raise whole other issues that they can see you haven't dealt with this. So I make no apologies for saying this, or for saying that I think the study of political science in this Aristotelian sense is a very valuable thing to do, to try and understand the public narratives and political narratives and moral behaviours that are being institutionally pushed. That this is a very helpful way of discussing and exploring them, and it's a great pity that more people in public life aren't aware of this. I was having a little chat with Grant about this. Okay, so trying to get the balance, and in this too, Aristotle argues that there should be rotation of rulership. By the way, and it doesn't come from Aristotle, but we see that when new city-states start to develop in the medieval period, so in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, where you have independent city-states, as you do in Italy, this principle is deployed. And the reason it's deployed is you can see that it makes a lot of sense. You realize that if someone is in power too long, and you might recall me saying that there had been a long tradition of ostracism in Athens. Even Pericles nearly became ostracized. There was an attempt to, remember, Pericles led Athens in the Peloponnesian War. There was an attempt to get him ostracized. He fought against it and won, but there were other leading public figures in Athenian life were ostracized. And Aristotle recognizes this, and he said, well, the way around this is to just not let anyone have power too long. So rotate it. And so it is really a very, which is why, by the way, we have limited periods of holding office with our elections. They can vary to a reasonable amount of time, or they can be, like in Australia, every 3 years on paper, but very often less because of the different constitutional mechanisms you can deploy to trigger an election. So Aristotle really understood the dangers of envy and class war. He wanted ultimately, which is also associated with the rule of law, with liberal states, liberal democratic states, that he wants the rule of law. I have to say somewhat critically that I often see the rule of law invoked by people that want to invoke it in one forum but not in another forum. But the rule of law ultimately means, there's a beautiful phrase, he who bids the law rule may be deemed to bid that God and reason alone rule, but he who bids man rule adds an element of the beast. Fabulous piece of oratory. I once wrote a book with a very close friend of mine called This Great Beast. I wrote it in the 90s. And a friend of mine, also a political scientist, read it. And the book was very much a defense of the rule of law. And he says, Wayne, the problem with your book is there's two problems. One is the specific laws and the other are lawyers. And I've come around his position. I think there's a lot of truth in that. But nevertheless, there's a kind of, if you don't have rule of law, then what you've got is even worse. So he sees his law as reason as unaffected by desire. Whether, though, reason is ever unaffected by desire is something a lot of philosophers will challenge. He does say, and this I think is very wise, that laws should be changed gradually. Two reasons for that, essentially. One is, don't expect law to deliver too much, and don't expect it to deliver too quickly. Well, and a third point is you may not foresee the consequences of what happens when you implement a new law. You may not realise what it's actually doing till it's been given some time to play out. So his preference is a admixture of oligarchy and democracy. He calls it a polity, or a constitutional government, a polity. So for the best state, he says the true legislator and statesman needs to know what is best in the abstract and what is the best attainable under the circumstances. So the polity is, in a sense, the most desirable, even if it's not the political necessarily, philosophically best, but it's the best in terms of the material that you have to deal with. Again, remember Aristotle's theory of causation. Material matters, and the material of the people that you've got making up the state. The true what's best in the abstract, so the philosophical input is welcome. And the political scientists will observe how to move from worse to better state, not simply to identify the best state. So that's why the comparative method is there. So you can see this isn't as good as that. Well, we can talk about why. And it's certainly not as good as over there, but over there the conditions and the citizens are so different that we could never really do that in a generation. Now, another great thing about Aristotle, I think, is that he recognizes the value of time in processes. And that's something I don't think Plato anywhere gives sufficient thought to. But Aristotle, with that comparative method, the biological approach he takes, he's looking at living things developing within time, over time. So he wants moderation and stability, and he says this is why the political class, it's never going to be in the position of being overly ambitious. It basically can't afford to throw everything up and only do politics. It doesn't have the resources only to do that. But it also will want to take its turn, he says, because they need to do it because things affect them very much. So a good state will create a strong middle class. And I have to say that as a general principle, if you're not the kind of person who thinks that you can get the revolution that you want and what you will get in a revolution will be all good, and there's a lot of academics and there's a lot of students who think that revolution will always work out. They can get what they want with that. I simply have to say, read history. The more history you read, you see, well, no one ever gets what they want. The French revolutionaries didn't get what they wanted. The Russian revolutionaries didn't get what they wanted. The English revolutionaries didn't get what they wanted. What happens, you only know what's really going to be out there when you see the reaction to the revolt, when you see and what plays itself over time. But what we can say is where there's strong middle class, there's much less likely social breakdown, and certainly no likelihood of an interior social breakdown. This is also why friendship is very important in Aristotle. It's both important in terms of being a personal quality, it's good for you personally, We know studies on aging, for example, show that the people who cope best with aging, I say this because my partner, she did a PhD on this, but studies on aging show that the most important quality that can be cultivated if you want to have a good old age is having friends and being friendly and having friends. And this is a kind of confirmation of Aristotle. But Aristotle also wants to create conviviality, friendship amongst members of the same classes, and not hostility, and between classes as well. But he wants a more affable kind of society. And remember, in the assembly where people are going, very often it's a horror in there. People are often using the assembly simply to denounce someone, ostracize them, which, send them out of the city or isolate them from any kind of political life, don't let them back into the public life. Rhetorical skills are used, the sophistic tricks are used, as we said, the poets are invoked, all the stuff that Plato had argued against. It can be brutal in there. And ultimately, Aristotle is saying, well, you want to make a better atmosphere in there. And you can do that if people are on the same page. Ultimately, too, Aristotle does see revolution, social breakdown as the worst, as the bad. And he sees the chief cause of it is desire for equality, love of gain, and love of honor. So too much equality, because you will always then be drawing attention to where there's inequality. And to be honest, there can never be equality. There just can't be. The resources aren't like that, opportunities aren't like that, offices aren't like that, characters aren't like that. You can ameliorate it, and social democratic systems have always tried to do that. And some of those ameliorations would actually confirm to exactly what Aristotle is talking about in terms of distributive justice in a middle class. But he's saying if you push it too far, everything just becomes subject to envy, and you only see the world if you don't have in terms of your gain. So it ultimately creates social breakdown. You need to maintain a spirit of law. You should be reluctant to change. You should treat people in a spirit of equality. That also means people who don't agree with you. They've got a different view. And we often talk about mutuality of respect. Strong middle class, not too much inequality, as I said, and it should not, political office should not be an incentive to procure wealth. And if you start reading around and studying people who have entered politics, you can quickly draw up a list of those people that have done nothing but engage in public life, and then after public life, because of their knowledge they've built up, the connections they make, end up very, very wealthy people. In fact, if I look at our political system from an Aristotelian point of view, I would just have to say, our system, there's a lot of love of gain, a lot of love of honor. The desire for equality is often pushing it. The law tends to be invoked when the law suits one group and not another group, but there isn't really a common set of sentiments about the values of the kind of laws we have. In part, that's because how often they've been changed, who are the winners, who are the losers from those changes. So there's often social disgruntlement. And I'd have to say our middle class is in disarray about social mores. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and it's complicated. And I really, and I don't like it when I see even former students of mine on Facebook, who I like personally, but I'm disappointed the way they engage in slinging off at others from a political party or a political leader that they don't like. Even if I think someone is not a good leader, I just don't like that way of doing business, because I think it creates a toxic political culture. And I think we do live in a toxic political culture, and the social media is an extension of the kind of pathologies that we have in our social and political formation. This is the last point I'll make about Aristotle. His view, remember, it's a very organic view of life. And the value of the comparative method is it never requires seeing perfection anyway, but it does tend to be attuned to diagnosing the different kind of pathologies that different constitutional types have. Again, and this covers all wings of the political spectrum, there is no political science society in which, if you are fairly critical, and by that I mean critical and fair, and not completely partisan and one-sided, you can find pathologies, weaknesses, deficiencies, you could say sicknesses even, within collective life. It's just part and parcel of what we are. And it's like a living organism. And which is where Aristotle's partly getting this from. We get sick. No one is ever completely, utterly healthy all the time. That's just the nature of living formation. And in saying that, I suppose I'm saying, yeah, Aristotle is really onto something. Lots of criticisms that can be made of Aristotle, but the comparative method, which deploys the notion that there are pathologies which you should be looking at, trying to diagnose them, so seeing how the worst can get better, that strikes me as a very good way for anyone who's spending their time doing political science to spend their time. Okay, we'll make a beginning of the Christian view of social and political life. I'm somewhat behind, as I said, but not to worry. Now, the phrase is often used, Western civilization, and it's one of those terms that oscillates being between completely useless and I never want to use it, or important enough for me to use it, and I have done a number of courses where I've used that term. But let me somewhat qualify the meaning of that term. First of all, by a civilization, you're talking about the scale of something. By Western, you're obviously, initially at least, talking about a location. But by a civilization, you're talking about a scale. And when we look at Westerns, anyone who uses the term Western civilization is being very Aristotelian, inevitably. And that is, even if they're not completely teleological in the sense of we've got exactly where we want, it's teleological in the sense that you tend to see that what came out of what people were doing ultimately built something for future generations that retrospectively you could see a kind of continuum. And you can see that continuum. It doesn't mean that the actors were conscious of building that. In fact, they weren't conscious of building that. That's not what they were doing. But we can see, and then there's ruptures and there's breaks, but we can see certain characteristic features that come in, that form a kind of mosaic over time. Now, they're not all good. Let's get this very straight. Western civilization, by the time we start to speak of the European nations and its offshoots, the United States, Australia, and its larger offshoot, the industrial world, is a powerhouse. And as a powerhouse, it ain't all good. You could say, not unjustly, not wrongly, that its crimes are perhaps the worst in history. And the two world wars would be exhibit A for that kind of argument, the scale of those wars. It doesn't let everybody else off the hook of being such nice guys. And in fact, I think the power of the West is commensurate with its deeds. So whatever its goods are and whatever its evils are related to the power. It's an expression of power. Here, I'm very much on the page with Friedrich Nietzsche, who I'll critically talk about, not without some sympathy, but also with a fair few criticisms, much later in the semester. So it is, when we speak of Western civilization, we're speaking of a process that we can see forms a continuum, though with various ruptures. It's staggered, but we can see that the modern conditions which lead to new developments in the technological infrastructure, economic infrastructure, administrative infrastructure, legal infrastructure, did I say political infrastructure, aesthetic infrastructure, all of these things, they do form a kind of continuum. They're not done completely without some interplay from other forces, but nevertheless, in the main, this is where they generate, where they have generated. And at the core of it, is Athens, the Greeks, and Jerusalem. It's at the core of it. And this is in part because after a period of great social breakdown in Western Europe, where you can't really use the term during that time in any meaningful sense, say for the first 1,000 years, or for those, at least with the breakdown of the Roman Empire, and when Rome moves to Byzantium near the end of the 4th century, you can't really talk of there being Western civilization of any sort until you get to Charlemagne. And even then, you've got to remember, it's agrarian, it's feudal, it's bloody, and so then when we get to the reurbanization of the West, still it's very staggered, and there's all these conflicts going on. So it's not that unified. In fact, there's all sorts of eruptive discordances and conflicts, really bloody. I just mentioned the First and Second World War. Well, in the middle of the 30 Years' War, or during the 30 Years' War, some parts of Central Europe lost 2/3 of their population. So that gives you a scale of, or gives you an idea of where war features in it and the scale of horror that's part of this story. And I would just say fascism, communism, as well as liberal democracy all come out of Western civilization. The nation state, you know, the atom bomb, all these things come out of Western civilization. So I'm not using this in terms of just putting a great sheen and gloss on it. But when I qualify this by saying the evil that people do tends to be commensurate to their power, the reason I say that is because it seems to me that a whole set of reasons for conflict are ubiquitous and not just located with any one people. And resource contestation, even in smaller scale groups, is a very bloody and protracted affair. Okay, so on the one hand, when I'm going to talk about Western civilization in a way that gives meaning to where I'm going with the course. It's something that no one seems to be going for, thinks they're going to get, and it doesn't really look like anything anyone thought they were getting, but we know what it means. Just as I know what it means, and you know what it means if I talk about an Islamic civilization or Chinese civilization. We have some sense. It's a very murky, smudgy term, but sometimes for the process of identification, something cartoon-like is the best we can do, and it's not a bad thing because it does bring something into focus. So it's a way of bringing things into focus. And what I want to bring into focus is how, over time, ideas generating and disciplines even, and ways of seeing and being in the world that come from Greece, come to fuse with ideas that ultimately have a Jewish and a Christian pedigree. There will be other factors. I would also say it's the history of the Germanic tribes. It's very, very important. And then the other subsequent political and social developments that occur. And now some of these I will mention because for the rest of today's lecture and very much next week, there's going to be a lot of history. The reason I bring in a lot of history is the history that I want to talk about, which lays down the basis of Christendom and the achievements, and I use that word deliberately, the achievements, that is certain things are built through Christian life and Christian interplay with non-Christian forms of life that become part and parcel of Western civilization. And again, not without great cost, not without great evil, if you like. But nevertheless, we need to know this. we need to know this history, and not enough people do. And I can't be sure that you know enough European history to be on the page with me if I just go to the authors. Okay, the first thing we need to know about the Jews and the Christians is we need to understand what ancients meant by God. The biggest obstacle to people today being able to open the Bible who aren't religious through some kind of accident or through their family or whatever, but we live in a very post-Christian society in the West, and it seems to me that the biggest obstacle to being able to take something like the Bible seriously is ultimately the obstacle, which here's an irony, because I think a lot of post-Christian people, so-called enlightened people, don't even recognize the irony. And the irony is this: unless you understand fundamental basics of anthropology and the basics of how human spiritedness, and I use that word decisively, the word spiritual leaves me a bit, can be a bit oogie boogie in a way I don't like. I'm a spiritual person, that kind of talk that leaves me rather cold. But spirited, in which human beings see themselves as part of a cosmon in which the spirits are active with them, and these spirits include at a most primordial level ancestral spirits, but they also include other spirit beings that give them orientation, that give them a sense of their place in the world and how to act within the world. This is an anthropological constant across the human race, and it's only in modern times that ideas drive the gods away. Ideas have driven the gods away, for many people at least. And so a god for all the ancient peoples is just, in the first instance, a hidden power, something that in a sense comes to us, beckons us, requires our supplication. We don't understand it. It's a mystery, but it's a power. We try and commune with it. We also need to remember that words themselves initially are seen as having a kind of magical power. Now, one way of looking at this, very enlightenment way of looking at this, is, well, that's all a lot of nonsense. It's like, if I recite a spell, that's just hoogie boogie. Yeah, but I think anthropologically we'd still do very similar things. That we use certain words in ways to persecute people, to shame people. And in doing that, we are kind of invoking some spirit within the community, some spirited action on the behalf of peoples to act and respond a certain way to the word that's doing the triggering. Again, I think of how universities now use the term trigger mechanisms. I don't like that. And I don't mind if others disagree with me, but I don't like that for all sorts of reasons. I think it's infantile. But on the other hand, what I see being acknowledged is that words matter, and they do matter. Whether or not you can use the words to get exactly what you want would depend on the kind of divinity you're invoking. So the divinity is the divinity of, non-domination or emancipation. Is that a very strong divinity? See, I'm using that term now in a term that's usually used abstractly. I'm trying to use it more figuratively. And this comes back again to the fact that early peoples are pre-conceptual, pre-abstract. They're very figurative. They're seeing things in very formative terms, in terms that are both intuitive but graspable, kind of pictorial, but conversible even if you can't see it. Conversible in some way. You attune yourself to these powers. As I said, modern secular imagination has dispensed with this, and I use the word imagination again very decisively. In this part of the course, if I sound like rambling, I tell you I'm not, even if I hum and ah and go this or there and there. But the essence of what I'm getting at is, I think, really important, because I don't think you can understand anything about your own tradition or any other traditions, including indigenous traditions, which are often invoked in a, I actually think, in a rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Condescending way by people pretending, feigning to be on the same page with groups of people when they're not, and who are just using the narratives and imagination of one group of people to advance their own sense of what the meaning of the world is. We all advance our sense of the meaning of the world. I don't particularly take anyone to task for doing that, but I do take people to task where they don't have sufficient understanding of the importance of the figurative use of the imagination in the tradition and the specific stories. And to just turn it into an abstraction is not understanding. So as you can probably tell, I think anthropology is a really, really important discipline. And I think the way I'm going to be talking about, the way I will be talking about religion for much of the rest of today and then for a fair bit of next week has a lot to do with anthropology as well as history. So historically, anthropologically, we know that people told stories, and the stories they told, ultimately, some of them had a certain sanctity and sacredness in the community. And they had a sanctity and sacredness because they were seen as helping take a group from its present via the wisdom of its elders, of its past. And I'll just move from straight anthropology here to traditions where the elders matter, as in Chinese culture, but also in indigenous cultures, to how that is then a very similar tradition takes place within Christendom with the idea of the history of the saints. It's a very similar kind of use of deployment of the imagination at work, a very similar thing at work. And again, I think sneering at this or thinking I'm above this just shows a certain failure to connect. Ultimately, the kind of questions that you have when your meaning is mapped out through a modern, more comprehensive deployment of the understanding, a more abstract deployment of the understanding, which is meant to be more comprehensive. It does have all sorts of gains. There's no doubt about that. Where I will question, and this will come up again later, so I will be questioning it, where I severely question it is whether the ultimate ends that you're pursuing are any more substantive and less superstitious, to use that term, than the ultimate ends that are deployed by the imagination of pre-modern peoples. So, hear this too. As much as we can see Christian impacting upon pagan life, it also will draw upon pagan life. There was a spate of books in the 20th century that were really on about let's revive paganism and how terrible Christianity is. Well, it's a complicated story. If you want to read that story, please do. But the books that I have read on the story are very, very simplistic. They fail to see the interaction and interpenetration of the pagan within the Christian, and the pagan indeed within the Jewish, and the Jewish within the Christian. But at the same time, there is a transformation. I don't deny that. And there is some point which there is conflict, where they are inimical. That's fine. And if you know what you're talking about and you raise a criticism, I'm all ears. You know, that's interesting. But if you're just being ideological and abstract, oh, paganism was just wonderful. As if people didn't make sacrifices, as if human sacrifice wasn't fairly common, as if it wasn't part of the web and woof, or the whatever you say, the web and tapestry of social participation and social life. You don't know what you're talking about. It was. And violence. Violence is an endemic component of the relationship between human and each other, the relationships between humans and the gods, and in some instances within the gods themselves. Exhibit A, Homer's world. Even stronger, Exhibit B, is Hesiod's world, where he shows all the gods in pandemonium with each other. But again, I'll just put it another way, even God and the devil, that great dualism of Christendom, or the idea of the supernatural in which there's these demonic forces, these are all aspects of the imagination, or expressions of how people have participated in reality, what they've responded to, and how what they've come to identify, how they've come to make sense of things. Ultimately, it may not square up philosophically, but philosophy has its own imagination at work, its own myths at work. And so a lot of this stuff that I'm saying actually comes from some I think, really great philosophers, going back to a guy called Vico, another guy called Harman, another guy called Herder, my guy Rosenstock-Huessy, a Jewish philosopher called Rosenzweig. They've really thought about this stuff in, I think, a far more sophisticated way than most people do. So I'm saying all this because I'll come back to the original point I want. If you want to understand why God, you have to understand the gods. And to understand the gods, you have to see it as a certain way of peoples orientating themselves within reality, and from which they get their sense of purposefulness, directives for participation, their lineage over time, the past, the future, the unknown, and the known, and in a pre-conceptual culture. Now, one of the things that the Jews do something different. They're not the only one in all respects, but ultimately what they end up with is unique. There is an Egyptian pharaoh, for example, that worshipped the sun, that was moving in monotheistic tendencies. The Greeks, as we saw, even beginning with Hesiod, is moving in a monotheistic direction. And in some ways, you're not completely wrong to see them, especially the classical Greek, the classical philosophers, as being monotheists. So you can qualify that in all sorts of ways, but it's not completely wrong. What we know also from the Bible is that the one God exists in a culture which there are already many gods. This would suggest that the many precede the one in terms of anthropological terms. And all the kind of evidence points to that, but there also is, often you will find there's a tendency even with pluralistic or polytheistic cultures to see one God as the strongest. Zeus is the strongest. And all-seeing in Hesiod, as I mentioned last week. So Zeus is the strongest. He pulls all the other gods up in the Iliad, I think it is, with the large rope showing his strength. But he's the sky god, the overseeing god. And we'll remember in Genesis that God, moves across the spirit, so he can all-seeing and see. Though he speaks, and then he sees that it's good, but he moves over the earth and the waters. This suggests. Well, what does it suggest? It suggests what we know. That the Jewish people were another group of people. There are all these groups of people with their different divinities, and the Jews had been captured by a polytheistic group, the Egyptians. And part of their exodus is a breach with pretty well everything that the Egyptians valued. And they break with it. But because of the experience, you can see all sorts of seepages from Egyptian to Jewish thoughts. And there's a number of very interesting books on this. But these seepages, but at the same time, what you're also seeing is a cut. No, that is cruelty, and we're not them. And of course, there will be genocidal acts by the Jews themselves, sometimes divinely ordained. But that's the people's survival. There's another story, another rationale. But what they're going for is in many ways perceived by themselves as diametrically opposed to the Egyptian. The other thing I wanted to say, I'll just jump back a bit before I carry on with the Jews, is the word religion. It's our modern sense of it is a very unhelpful sense. And the reason it is unhelpful, our modern sense of it is very much a post-Reformation use of the term. And, and that means that politically, as this is played out, that meant is religion is a private matter, and you can keep that. You know, that's, you can believe that as a group, but your religion is what you privately believe. Now, we know from when we talked about the Greeks, and the same is true of the Romans, is in the ancient world, religion was very much a public matter, especially in antiquity, in Greek and Roman societies, but elsewhere as well. It was very much a public matter. But even in tribal societies, it's not like in a tribal society you've got someone going, oh, I don't believe that story that you've just told me about this spirit being, because, you know, I've made up my own one, or I've found a new one, and tends not to be like that. Though it may be, as different bands, they may have brought together different senses of sacredness, and we can see as the different tribes come together that they do bring with them different divinities, and we know this from Roman history, that that's part of its pedigree, part of its story. So, but religion simply means, and it's a rather late-ish term, it's pre-Reformation, religio simply means the bonds that connect us to life. So the God that you are supplicating to, that you're worshipping, that you're giving your sacrifices to, that is the God that is you're basically looking for a protector. Just as politics begins as a protection racket, in a sense, so too does religion at an anthropological level. Now, the communing with the gods, that tends to be something that gets hived off eventually to a particular group of people, the medicine man or the priest class. And again, we find anthropologically, we find all over the place there are those that somehow are able to access these special powers. Okay, just bringing that, so you know, one of the earliest divisions of labor is between warriors, producers, and priests, and very often the priests will be the rulers, or interacting with the warriors, because often the warrior may be a ruler in one respect, but the warrior is still dependent on the priest to get favorable actions from the god in order to go ahead. That doesn't mean there's not misinterpretations. You can see also why people are saying, oh, this is all magical stuff. Well, in a sense, yes, it's true. This is a way of living in an enchanted world. But here's the rub. It's meaningful. And people live with meaning, not just facts. People live with meaning. And there is not, and I'll just say it again, a moral meaning that you can philosophically defend is ultimately no more vigorous, rigorous, or perhaps even benign than this kind of collective meaning. I'll say that straight out, because the arrogance of modern know-alls really just drives me to sheer distraction. We know little. I'm trying to, it might sound I'm, you know, ranting, and I sort of am, and I'll be honest, but I really want to convey to you how little you know, how little I know, and I've been doing this for forever, and I'll be retiring at the end of this year, but how little we all know. And if you want to know things, go and read this stuff, go and look at it, and go and compare things. Aristotle's kind of right, go and compare things. So this is, I'll just finish this slide and then end it for today. One of the things about monotheism, and again, if you read Hesiod with the Greeks, you get the feeling it must have been a very similar kind of experience, is that when there's many gods, then there's each one with their own domain, there's also a great conflict that's going on. So the powers, in a sense, the powers of divinity are not concordant, they're discordant. Monotheism brings all the other powers. It doesn't mean there's not now lesser spirited beings, or, you know, lesser beings in the spiritual kingdom, so to speak, but they come into concord. This is, in a sense, a great breakthrough in human beings able to perceive that there's a sense of unity that they have. Now don't forget, though, the God of the Jews is a God of the tribe. He is both a universal God, but also a God of the tribe. In a sense, being a God of the tribe, that never, strictly speaking, changes. It's the Christians that will take the God of the tribe and spread it over the globe. And we'll see that next week when we look more closely at the dispute between Peter and Paul. So, as a monotheistic, it's interested in God. It's unlike the Greeks. It's not interested in much in the arts. Certainly not in the arts for sheer pleasure as the Greeks did. Nor interested in philosophy. There's no philosophy in the Old Testament. And it fits with what the people most need. It's the last thing they need, is that they're not living like the Greeks were in city-states. There are people struggling for their, first of all, they struggle to build up a kingdom, that collapses, and then they live in the diaspora. So Exodus, building of the kingdom, clearing the way, all these wars, build up of the kingdom, decline of the kingdom, living in diaspora. But from the Jewish perspective, and the biblical narrative is a story, a chronicle of all that passage, and of the persistence of the God's love for the people, the covenant that God has with the people's deviating from it, then coming back to it, and the promise, the ultimate promise. This too is, and again, they're not, this is very pre-modern, and pre-philosophical, and certainly pre-fact science, no doubt. But that people would see illness, sickness, death and suffering as something that might be a punishment. There's nothing unique to the Jews about that. But they did see that our failures, the things of life that go wrong, that suggests that we've done something wrong. And in a sense, that's the whole story of the fall. Adam and Eve, there was something that was wrong, a sin. And the word sin simply means missing the mark. And missing the mark really means not obeying God's word, not being righteous. But God's word is such, and I'll conclude it now with just this little bit of Genesis. You recall in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, that they are forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge. And Eve disobeys and they eat from it. And this is the subject of one of the greatest poems in the English language, Paradise Lost by John Milton. It's fantastic. He was a Puritan, but it's a fantastic rendition, biblical interpretation of what goes on. And what are they told? They are told sickness and death will be the result of eating from the fruit of knowledge. And that's true. I just think you cannot have knowledge unless you experience sickness and death. This is how we build up knowledge. We have to see our own sickness. We have to see our own death, in a sense, our death across times and over generations. We learn and pass on and transmit. So to put it bluntly, what is unique about the Jews is the scale of the chronicle of their vision, how multi-generational it is, how polyvocal it is, how various different aspects of a chronicle that is ultimately a chronicle of a relationship between their God and their human. And prior to that, there had been nothing quite like the Bible. And since that, there's been nothing quite like the Bible in terms of so multi-generational. Of course, the Christians come along and put themselves at the end of it and say, we are what was being, or Jesus is what the prophecy was all about, and we continue the covenant, and it changes its nature. But I'll talk about that next week. Okay. Thank you very much. I will see you all next week. And cheers. Enjoy your week.